The body knows when it's finished. Not the mind. The mind will lie to you for hours, bargain with your legs, negotiate with your spine. But the body doesn't negotiate. It simply stops. Erin Golt's body stopped at 3:47 in the morning on the second floor of the Ellery estate, 15 feet from the door she needed to reach. She'd been on her feet since 8 the previous morning. 19 hours of hauling industrial fans, running wet vacs over flooded hardwood, dismantling the waterlogged bookcase in the west sitting room after the burst pipe had turned half of the second floor into a shallow lake. Her company had sent 3 technicians for the emergency restoration call. 2 had rotated out after the first 8 hours. Erin had stayed. She always stayed. It wasn't ambition. She didn't love the work. She loved the $34 an hour in overtime, which went directly toward the payment plan she owed Ridgemont Financial. The same company her younger brother Corey had effectively gifted a lawsuit 8 months ago when he rear-ended another vehicle on a wet highway at 50 kilometers over, totaling 2 cars, hospitalizing the other driver, and shattering the last stable thing Erin had left in her life. The accident wasn't her debt, but Corey was 22 and uninsured and completely defenseless against a civil suit. And Erin had co-signed the settlement agreement because the alternative was watching him lose everything before he'd had a chance to build anything. So she stayed, every shift. She was carrying the final load of saturated floor padding down the hallway toward the service elevator when her knees gave out. Not gradually, not with warning. They simply went the way a table leg fails when the joint has been stressed one too many times beyond its design. The padding hit the floor first. Erin hit the floor a half-second later, her shoulder catching the edge of the baseboard molding, her back coming to rest against the wall. She told herself she'd get up in a minute. She didn't get up. Grayson Ellery did not sleep. Not properly. Not the kind of sleep that healed anything, the kind that left a man reoriented, functional, something approximating human. He'd averaged 3 hours a night for the past 4 months, which his doctor had described as dangerous 3 separate times. Grayson had thanked him and returned 12 phone calls in the parking garage before the building door had closed behind him. At 3:51 a.m., he was in his private study on the second floor, reviewing satellite logs from a contract that had gone sideways in the Maritimes. The estate was quiet, or should have been. The restoration crew had been working since the previous morning, clearing the flood damage from a failed pipe behind the East Library wall, and the last of the machines had gone silent sometime around 3:30. He'd assumed they'd left. He opened his study door to retrieve a document from the filing room down the hall and nearly stepped on her. Grayson stopped. He stood in the doorway with a glass of water in his hand and looked down. She was slumped against the wall, legs stretched out at an angle that suggested she'd tried to stand and given up partway through. Her work uniform, dark gray, a small company logo stitched at the chest, was damp at the knees and both sleeves. Her hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in and was lying across her cheek. Her head was tilted to one side at an angle that should have been uncomfortable. She was completely asleep. He'd seen this before. Not here, not in this hallway, but in mirrors, in the faces of men he'd pushed past their limits, and eventually in his own reflection. The specific quality of a person who hadn't stopped because they wanted to, but because there was simply nothing left to run on. It wasn't rest, it was collapse. There was a difference, and he recognized it with the precision of someone who had been that person for most of his adult life, and had learned to hate what it looked like on others, because it was easier than facing what it meant about himself. He crouched down. Her hands rested open in her lap. Even in the low light of the hall sconces he could see the cracking along her knuckles, the rawness of skin that had been in cold water and chemical solution for far too long. There was a shallow scrape on her shoulder where she'd hit the baseboard on her way down. "Hey," he said. "Nothing." He said it again louder. He touched her shoulder once, firmly. She stirred, her head shifted, she didn't wake. Grayson set his glass on the floor. He thought about calling Mrs. Carmichael, who managed the household staff with military precision and a complete absence of sentiment. He stood. He walked 3 steps toward his study. He turned back. A short, sharp exhale, the same sound he made when a calculation came back wrong. He walked to her, crouched, and lifted her. She was lighter than she should have been for someone who'd spent a full day doing physical labor. That was the first thing that struck him. The second was that the moment he gathered her against his chest, she made a small sound, not a word, barely a breath, and her head settled into the curve of his shoulder the way water settles into low ground, like she'd been expecting it. She smelled like industrial cleaner, and something underneath it, something faint and warm he couldn't immediately place. He carried her down the east corridor to the nearest unoccupied guest suite, laid her on the edge of the bed, and started to pull his arms away. Her hand moved. Slowly, with the clumsy deliberateness of someone completely unconscious, her fingers found his wrist. The grip wasn't strong. It was desperate in a way that had nothing to do with strength. The grip of someone holding onto the last solid thing available. Grayson didn't move. He looked at her face. Fully asleep, the controlled, neutral expression she almost certainly wore during waking hours entirely absent, replaced by something younger and unguarded. He could have freed his wrist easily. A small rotation, and she'd have released without stirring. He didn't. He reached back with his free hand, dragged the armchair from the corner of the room, and sat down. He stayed until the sky outside the window went from black to gray to the pale, flat white of a winter morning. Erin woke up wrong. Not the soft disorientation of an unfamiliar hotel. Wrong in the way of someone whose internal alarm is sounding before her eyes have finished opening, because the ceiling above her was 12 feet high and trimmed with plaster molding, and she had absolutely not fallen asleep anywhere near a ceiling like that. She sat up fast. The room assembled itself around her, a guest suite the size of her entire apartment, pale linen everywhere, a window showing gray morning sky over snow-covered mountain ranges. Her body ached in a specific, enumerating way. Her mouth was dry. Her right arm didn't come with her when she tried to move. She looked down. Her hand was inside another, large, tanned, with a scar crossing the knuckle of the index finger and a watch that cost considerably more than her car. She followed the arm upward to the man it belonged to, asleep in an armchair beside the bed, head tilted back at an angle that was going to cause him real discomfort when he woke. Dark hair, a jaw rough with several days of stubble. The kind of face that would have been handsome if it hadn't been assembled in a way that suggested it had never once been arranged into an expression that invited approach. Grayson Ellery. She knew who he was. You couldn't work restoration contracts in this city without knowing the name of the man who'd acquired the old refinery district and rebuilt it inside of 2 years. You didn't read a local paper without eventually encountering the phrase Ellery Group. You especially didn't respond to a flood emergency at his estate without doing enough preliminary research to understand that this was not a man you inconvenienced. She had apparently inconvenienced him considerably. More immediately, she was holding his hand, or he was holding hers. She couldn't determine which of those things was true, and the uncertainty was deeply alarming. She began the careful, agonizing process of extracting her fingers, one at a time with the slowness of someone trying not to trigger something. Index finger, middle finger. She was nearly clear. His hand closed. His eyes opened. Grayson Ellery did not wake up the way normal people woke. There was no groggy blinking, no confused pause. He went from asleep to fully present in the span of a single second, his gaze finding her face with the directness of someone who had never allowed himself the disorientation of not knowing exactly where he was. Erin froze. The silence held for several seconds. Then, "I can explain," she said, and was immediately embarrassed by how her voice cracked on the last word. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand, an assessment, the way you press a bruise to determine its depth. "You hit the baseboard on the way down," he said. His voice was low and flat, rough with disuse, carrying the specific texture of someone who had not been sleeping well for a long time. "I brought you in here. She worked through this. You carried me. The alternative was leaving you in the hallway." His expression gave nothing away. That would have been an insurance issue. Erin looked at her hands, both of them, no blood, no new injury. She looked back at him, enough composure returning to form a sentence. "I'll get my equipment and head out. I'm sorry for..." "You're not going anywhere for the next hour." He said it the way someone else might observe that the road was icy, factual, non-negotiable. "Mrs. Carmichael is bringing breakfast. I don't need..." "You've been on your feet for 19 hours. You collapsed alone in a hallway at 4 in the morning. He released her hand, finally. He stood, rolling his neck. The crack was audible. "That's a medical situation, not a preference." "I was resting." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "Almost. You were unconscious." Erin pressed her lips together. She didn't have a reasonable counter to that. The knock at the door was 3 quick, cautious raps. Carmichael entered carrying a tray that smelled of eggs and good coffee. And she was a composed woman in her 60s who had managed the estate for years, and whose face, when she encountered Grayson standing beside the guest bed in last night's shirt, while a young woman in work clothes sat on the mattress, gave absolutely nothing away. She set the tray on the table by the window, and withdrew with the efficiency of someone who understood that her opinions had not been invited. Grayson brought Erin a plate and held it out. "Eat," he said. She looked at it. Scrambled eggs, thick toast, roasted tomatoes. More food than she typically allowed herself across 2 meals. "I'm not hungry." "Then eat anyway." He sat back in the armchair, poured himself a black coffee, and watched her over the rim of the cup. She picked up the fork. Her hand trembled, a fine, persistent tremor she couldn't stop. She got a piece of toast to her mouth and chewed. It tasted like nothing. She kept eating. "Tell me about the debt," he said. Erin's fork stopped. "You've been swapping shifts with another technician on this contract," he said, not unkindly, but with a precision that narrowed the space in the room considerably. "Your company's work log shows 2 names. Your colleague hasn't been on site since noon yesterday. Nobody runs a 19-hour solo shift for overtime." She set the fork down. "My brother," she said, shorter than she'd intended. "How bad?" Erin laughed, a short sound with no humor in it. "Which part? The accident, the other driver's hospital bills, the civil settlement, or the private loan I took out to cover the settlement before the creditor lawyered up?" Grayson said nothing. He waited, and somehow the waiting was harder than another question. "He's 22, she said, quieter. "He's not a bad person. He made a bad decision in bad weather, and a woman spent 6 weeks in hospital." She looked at the plate in her lap. "She's recovered. He's okay." But the bill didn't go away. "And you co-signed." He had nothing to put his name to. Grayson looked at her for a moment. Then he looked out at the snow-covered mountains, the pale sky going lighter at the eastern edges. "Finish that," he said, "then sleep. The room is yours for the day." "Mr. Ellery." "When I want you to leave," he said, standing, "I'll be considerably less subtle about it." He left. The door closed. Erin sat alone with the food and the mountain view and the particular suspended feeling of a trap that hadn't closed yet. 3 hours later, Grayson sat behind his desk with Maddox across from him and a thin folder between them. Maddox ran operations. He was lean, precise, and possessed the calm, relaxed manner of a man who was very comfortable with difficult situations. He'd pulled the file in under 2 hours. "Erin Galt, 27, Maddox said, leaning back in his chair. "Clean record, no affiliations, no complications, just a working contractor for the past 5 years. The debt is real. $74,000 consolidated, currently held by Ridgemont Financial, East End. Private firm. Technically operates within the law." He paused. The technicality being that the interest structure is specifically designed to ensure no one ever touches the principal. Grayson looked at the figure on the page. He'd seen worse. He'd built structures like it, years ago, before he'd gotten particular about the kind of business he ran. That wasn't the point. "She's paying them monthly just to prevent the number from growing," Maddox continued. "At the current rate, she does that for 12 years. She works 3 jobs. This one, weekend shifts at a warehouse up north and overnight care aid at a facility in the valley." He looked up. "She's running herself into the ground." Grayson closed the folder. The feeling in his chest was not sympathy. Sympathy was a word for other people. What he felt was something closer to structural offense, the way you feel when you see a sound load-bearing wall being used as a rubbish surface. Erin Galt was grinding herself to nothing to service a debt that had been designed to never release her. She was doing it in his house, on his floors, while the company running her into the ground sat in an office tower and collected interest on her brother's worst night. "Buy the paper," Grayson said. Maddox's expression shifted slightly. "From Ridgemont?" "All of it. Full settlement. Tell them if Erin Galt receives any further contact from that firm or any subsidiary, I'll be reviewing their operating agreements with the city with considerable attention." He walked to the window. "I suspect several wouldn't survive the scrutiny. You know, if you hold the paper, you hold the debt. I know how purchasing works. I'm asking what the plan is. You're going to garnish a restoration contractor's wages for the next decade." "She isn't a restoration contractor anymore." Grayson kept his eyes on the mountains. "I have a vacancy I've been unable to fill for 2 years. Live-in facilities manager for the private floors. I can't put someone in those rooms I don't trust, and I can't trust someone who doesn't know how to be invisible." He turned. "She spent 19 hours in this house, and I encountered her exactly once, and that was because she was unconscious." Maddox looked at him for a long moment. "You're offering a stranger access to your private wing because she fell asleep in a hallway. I'm offering her the job because she didn't ask for help when she needed it, and she didn't make a production of it when she got it anyway." Grayson picked up his phone. "Those are not common qualities. I respect them. Make the call to Ridgemont." Erin woke the second time to a room that was quieter and an ache that had reduced itself to something she could actually ignore. She'd slept nearly 10 hours. She hadn't slept 10 consecutive hours since she was a teenager. Her body felt as if it had been returned from somewhere it had gone without asking her. The chronic low-level pain in her lower back dissolved to something so faint she had to check twice that it was still there. On the table by the window, where the breakfast tray had been, there was a stack of folded clothes. Dark trousers, a soft cream sweater still in its packaging. A note underneath it, written in angular, economical handwriting. Office, East Wing, this evening. Erin stared at the sweater for a long time. She showered. She dressed. The cashmere was unreasonably soft and she resented how much she noticed it. She walked corridors she knew from the restoration work and found the East Wing and stood outside a heavy oak door and knocked twice. "Come in." He was at his desk, jacket off, cuffs rolled to the elbow. Reading, he didn't look up immediately. She understood with some instinct she couldn't fully explain that this pause was deliberate. Then he closed the folder and looked at her. "Sit down." She sat. "Ridgemont Financial has been paid in full," he said. "No preamble. As of this morning, you have no outstanding obligation to them or any related entity." He slid a document across the desk, a release of debt, stamped and signed, her name, a zero balance, a date stamp from 3 hours ago. The blood left her face. What? It was barely a word. "You had a lender bleeding you dry on a debt structured to make repayment impossible," Grayson said, as if describing a mechanical fault. "I find that arrangement offensive when it's operating on my property. That's $74,000. I'm aware of the amount." "Why would you?" "Because I have a position," he said, "and the person I want to fill it is currently financially compromised in a way that creates a vulnerability I don't accept in my private staff. So I removed the vulnerability." He pushed a second document across the desk. "The debt transfers to me, no interest. You repay it through your salary over a term we negotiate. The terms are fair. You're welcome to have a lawyer review them before you sign." Erin looked at the contract. She looked at him. "What's the job?" she asked. He told her. The private floors, his study, his bedroom, the gym, the secured rooms, access no other member of staff held, direct report to him exclusively. The salary, when she read it, required a deliberate effort not to react to. "Why me?" she said when he'd finished, quieter than she'd meant it to come out. "You don't know me." Grayson looked at her hands, which she'd folded tightly in her lap, a habit she'd developed to hide the tremor that appeared when she was overtired, and the ache in her knuckles was peaking. Then his gaze moved back to her face. "You worked through a 19-hour emergency in a stranger's house as in the middle of winter," he said, "and you didn't cut a single corner. I can see it in the floors. I can see it in the walls." Something underneath the careful surface of him was still long enough that she caught a glimpse of it. Not warmth exactly, but something that recognized what it saw. You ran until you had nothing left, and you didn't stop until your body made the decision for you. I trust that. I trust people who can't be bought, because they've never had the luxury of being anything other than exactly what they are. He set a pen on top of the contract. Erin looked at the pen for a long time. She picked it up and signed. The private floors were a world unto themselves. Erin learned them the way you learn a new city, not from a map but from walking it, from noticing where the light changed and where the air carried something unasked for and human. She learned that Grayson kept a specific scotch from a Nova Scotia distillery, not because he preferred it, but because the burn was sharp enough to keep him awake through the long nights. She learned that he paced when he was working something through, and the carpet near the study window held the faint compressed path of someone who'd stood there 1,000 times. She learned that he left his dress shirts folded on the chair rather than hung, a detail that told her quietly that he'd learned to care for his own things long before there'd been anyone else to do it. She kept her hours clean. She worked when he wasn't there. Until she wasn't. It was a Tuesday, past 11 at night, and she was finishing the bookshelves in his study. She'd thought the estate was still. She'd been humming, a habit from her mother, who'd filled every house she'd been in with some low, constant note running underneath the work. The heavy oak door opened without a sound. Grayson stood in the frame. His jacket was gone. The top buttons of his shirt were undone. He had the look of someone who had moved through something he would not describe and had no intention of being asked about it. And the bruise developing along his jaw was fresh enough to still be deciding what color it wanted to be. He looked at her and said nothing. He walked straight to the wet bar, poured 2 fingers of scotch, and drank it standing. "I'll finish in the morning," Erin said, setting down her cloth. "Stay," The word came out rough, as if it had cost him something. He set the glass down and walked to the chair behind his desk and sat heavily, elbows on the desk, head dropping into both hands. "Don't talk. Just keep doing what you were doing." Erin stood still for a moment. She knew what it was to be in a room with someone at the absolute edge of themselves. She'd done it for Corey in the hospital waiting room. She'd done it for her mother in the last 2 years of her illness. She understood, in the particular way that only people who've had to learn it understand, that sometimes the only thing you can offer another person is the proof that you're not afraid of staying. She turned back to the bookshelves. She worked slowly. She didn't hum. The silence in the room shifted, from tight to hollow to the particular quiet of a winter night, when the cold outside makes the warmth inside feel like something that had to be earned. 30 minutes later, she finished the last shelf and turned around. Grayson was asleep in his chair, his face turned toward the desk, every hard angle of it gone slack, younger in a way that was almost difficult to look directly at. The scotch sat untouched beside his elbow. Erin walked to the desk. The lamp was aimed directly at his face, too bright, the kind of light that doesn't let you stay under. Slowly, she reached across and clicked it off. The room went blue with the winter light coming through the windows. She gathered her things and left. The next morning, on the small table in her room where she kept her work phone and her water bottle, there was a box. White cardboard, no logo, tied with a length of plain string. Inside was a pair of thermal-lined work gloves, chemical-resistant, the proper kind, rated for the exact type of solution she'd been using for weeks. They were from a specialty supplier in a town 3 hours away. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The storm came off the mountains 3 weeks later. The kind that settles in and refuses to move, ice in the gusts, the estate's perimeter lights flickering in the wind. Something was wrong before Erin could have said why. The security rotation had been doubled since midday. Maddox had moved between rooms all evening, with the focused quiet of a man expecting something to arrive. At 2:30 in the morning, the private elevator engaged. Erin heard it from her room. She was already awake. She opened her door to a dark hallway and watched the elevator open, and she knew, because she'd had to recognize these things before in her life, had learned to read the specific body language of someone holding themselves together through something that was trying very hard to pull them apart, that the dark wet spreading across Grayson's left side was not his shirt. Mr. Ellery. He stopped. His face was the color of January light on concrete, flat, drained, the color of someone running on reserves they didn't have. His hand pressed to his side wasn't doing enough. "Go back to bed, Erin. You're bleeding through your shirt." "I'm fine." She crossed the corridor in 6 steps. She didn't reach for him yet. She could see from the way he was holding himself that the wrong contact would undo whatever he was running on. "Don't tell me you're fine. Tell me what we're dealing with." His jaw tightened. "No calls. Nobody comes up here." "Then talk to me." "Below the ribs. Missed anything critical? 1 sentence at a time, stripped down, black bag, under the bathroom sink." She got it. She moved fast in emergencies. She'd had enough of them to stop being surprised by her own steadiness when it mattered. He'd lowered himself to the edge of the bed by the time she came back. She opened the bag. She said, not a request. He reached for the buttons, but his fingers were slick and shaking, and after the second she stepped forward and did it herself, working the fabric away from the wound as carefully as she could, which still wasn't carefully enough, judging by the sound he made low in his throat. The wound was a jagged horizontal cut below his left ribs, deep-edged, the kind made by something dragged with intention. Erin had seen bad things before. She had held Corey's hand in the ER and kept her voice level while coming apart completely on the inside. She did the same thing now. "I can clean it, pack it, close it with glue and butterflies. I can't stitch. Tell me what you need and in what order." "Saline first, then pack, then close and wrap." He gripped the mattress edge with his free hand, knuckles going white. "Don't stop when it burns." "I won't." She uncapped the saline and poured it directly into the wound. His entire body went rigid, every muscle, a single cable of tension, and his hand shot out and found her hip, not rough, not demanding, just grounding, anchoring himself to something solid while the pain moved through him. She didn't step back. She pressed the gauze in and held it hard. "Breathe," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Keep breathing. I need you here." For the next 10 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the ones that had to be there. Her instructions, his breath, the storm against the windows. When the bleeding finally slowed, she worked the closure with shaking hands and sealed it with more precision than she'd known she was still capable of. She wrapped the pressure bandage and tied it tight. Then she sat down on the floor. She pressed her hands flat to her knees and looked at the blood on her skin and tried to locate a pace for her breathing that wasn't a sprint. Erin. She looked up. He was still on the edge of the bed, watching her. The blood loss had stripped something from his expression, some outer layer that was usually present, leaving something rawer underneath. Something she recognized, because she'd seen it on her own face in the worst months. The look of a person who had been holding everything up for so long, they'd forgotten what it felt like when the weight stopped for a moment. "You did well," he said quietly. She laughed, not the sound she'd intended. "I just didn't want to deal with the cleanup." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. He reached down and caught her wrists lightly, drawing her hands away from where she'd been pressing them against her knees without realizing it. She stood. She went into the bathroom and ran the water hot and scrubbed her hands until the skin was pink and the water ran clear. And when she came back, she sat beside him on the edge of the bed and cleaned the dried blood from his jaw with a warm cloth, the way she'd seen her mother do for people who needed it, without making them ask twice. He let her. When she told him to lie down, he resisted for a moment. The pain medication she'd made him take was beginning to blur the edges of him, his voice slightly slower than usual. "If I close my eyes, it all starts moving, the whole thing just." "I know," Erin said. She did know. She'd felt it for most of the past year, the specific terror of stopping, because the thing you'd been out running would find you the moment you did. She had run from it across 19-hour shifts and double-booked weekends, and the particular exhaustion of never being able to afford the luxury of standing still. "It won't move," she said. "I'm right here." She put her hand on his uninjured shoulder and pushed, gently but without negotiation, until he let himself go back against the pillow. He hissed with the movement. She pulled the duvet up over him. She turned to gather the kit and the bloodied cloths. A hand closed around her wrist. Weak, barely there, the weight of a question, not a command. She turned back. His eyes were half closed, the medication softening the edges of him, but his fingers stayed around her wrist with the same grip she remembered from the first night. The grip that wasn't demanding anything. Just asking. Just, don't let me be alone with this. She remembered waking up to find him still in the armchair. She'd assumed, in the first confused seconds of consciousness, that his presence meant something transactional, something she needed to decode and guard against. It had taken her 3 more weeks to understand that he'd simply stayed because she'd needed someone to stay, and he'd made the decision quietly and without ceremony and never mentioned it again. Erin kicked off her shoes. She lay down carefully on her side, facing him, keeping herself a safe distance from the bandaging. His fingers stayed around her wrist, loose now, confirming. "I'm here," she said. The first time she'd said anything into a room that wasn't required of her. Just true, just her voice in the dark. "Go to sleep, Grayson." His name. The first time she'd used it. Something left his face, the last piece that had been holding itself in place even while everything else came down. He exhaled. Long, slow. The sound of someone setting down something they had been carrying for a very long time, and finally, for one night, deciding they didn't have to pick it back up. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into something regular and genuine, and the room was quiet except for the storm and the 2 of them inside it. Erin lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling she hadn't yet learned the particular cracks of, and thought about the fact that a clear-headed version of herself would be calculating exits, would be constructing the logical argument for why none of this was real. Why men like Grayson Ellery did not carry exhausted women to guest suites out of kindness, why debt forgiveness was leverage in a language she hadn't finished translating yet. But the clear-headed version of her hadn't slept a full night in 8 months, hadn't had anyone stay without being asked, hadn't felt, in a very long time, like the ground beneath her was solid. Grayson Ellery had sat in a chair until dawn because she'd grabbed his wrist in her sleep. He hadn't used it. He'd solved the problem she'd never told him about, and left gloves on her table from a shop 3 hours away, and signed no note to them. He'd asked her to stay in his study, not because he needed something from her, but because she was the only person in the house who didn't flinch when she saw what he was underneath the rest of it. Erin's fingers rested lightly over his knuckles. She didn't want to leave. That was either the most dangerous thing she'd allowed herself to feel in years, or the first honest thing. She wasn't certain yet which one it was. But for the first time since Corey's accident had rearranged her entire life into something she could barely recognize, her body wasn't fighting the stillness. Outside, the storm moved east, the estate settled. The man who controlled half the contracts in the province slept with her hand resting over his, as if it had always known exactly where it belonged, and as if he, for all his careful, fortified silence, had been waiting a very long time for someone willing to find that out.